Imagine a city surrounded by enemies, a place where every step you take is watched, and every word you speak can be used against you. This is not a scene from a dystopian novel. It's the reality of 16th century Geneva, the city where John Calvin, one of the most influential figures of the Protestant Reformation, lived and worked. Geneva was a small but strategically important city, nestled between the Alps and Lake Geneva. It was a city that had just thrown off the yoke of Catholic rule and was trying to establish itself as a bastion of Protestantism. But it was far from the perfect school of Christ that John Knox, a Scottish reformer, would later call it. Instead, it was a city in constant flux, a place where the ideals of reform were constantly tested against the harsh realities of daily life. John Calvin arrived in Geneva in 1536, a young man with a vision. He had fled his native France to escape persecution for his Protestant beliefs and found a city that was ripe for change. Calvin was not just a theologian. He was a reformer, a man who believed that the Church needed to return to the pure teachings of the Bible. He saw Geneva as a place where he could put his ideas into practice, but Calvin's vision was not shared by everyone. The city was a melting pot of different beliefs and backgrounds. There were those who supported him, like the city's leaders, but there were also those who opposed him, like the libertines, who resisted the strict moral codes Calvin wanted to impose. The city council, which had the final say in matters of governance, often clashed with Calvin over his reforms. One of the most significant institutions Calvin established was the Genevan Consistory. This was not just a church body, it was a moral police force. The consistory was tasked with ensuring that the people of Geneva lived according to the strict moral standards Calvin believed were necessary for a true Christian community. They would visit homes, listen to confessions, and even punish those who were found guilty of sins like adultery, blasphemy, or even dancing on Sundays. The consistory's records, which have been studied by historians like Robert Kingdon and William Monterre, paint a picture of a city where no one was safe from scrutiny. People were reported for the smallest infractions, and the consistory's decisions could have serious consequences. For example, a woman who was caught dancing at a wedding could be publicly whipped, and a man who was found guilty of adultery could be banished from the city. Despite the strict rules, Geneva was not a monolithic community. There were still Catholics living in the city, and the surrounding regions were predominantly Catholic. This meant that Geneva had to navigate a delicate balance between its own reformist ideals and the need to maintain trade and diplomatic relations with its neighbors. The city's leaders, including Calvin, had to be pragmatic and sometimes make compromises that went against their strict moral code. Calvin's influence extended beyond the city's borders. His writings, particularly the Institutes of the Christian Religion, became a cornerstone of Protestant thought, but his ideas were not always welcomed. In fact, Calvin faced opposition from other reformers, including Martin Luther, who had his own vision of the Reformed Church. Calvin's emphasis on predestination, the idea that God has already chosen who will be saved, was particularly controversial. Despite the challenges, Calvin's vision for Geneva began to take shape. The city's schools, which he helped establish, became centers of learning where the next generation of reformers was educated. The city's laws were reformed to reflect Calvin's moral principles, and the church became a central part of daily life. But the city was never the perfect school of Christ that Calvin envisioned. It was a place of constant tension, where the ideals of reform were always being tested against the realities of human nature. The story of Geneva is a story of a city in transition, a place where the future of Protestantism was being shaped, but not without struggle. As you read on, you will discover how this small city on the shores of Lake Geneva became a crucible for the ideas that would shape the modern world. But for now, let's take a closer look at the man behind it all, John Calvin. The image of John Calvin as a single-minded and incredibly successful reformer has stuck around even in recent historical studies. Historians have long pointed out that Geneva's fight for political independence played a big role in its acceptance of the Reformation. The new government was unstable, and city leaders were worried about chaos. This narrative often highlights Calvin's victory over his political opponents in 1555 as a turning point. William Montaigne, in his book Calvin's Geneva, described this as the triumph of a superior mind and an inflexible will over a disorganized opposition. Philip Benedict also noted Calvin's efforts to silence any challenges to his teachings, but acknowledged that Geneva's unique situation as a newly independent city, without a long tradition of self-rule, made Calvin's success possible. William Nafy, in his earlier work, emphasized Calvin's overall success by 1557, even as he placed Calvin more firmly in the Genevan context. However, recent scholarship is painting a more nuanced picture of the Reformation in Geneva. It shows a reform with ambitious goals, but with less rigid and complete effects. For example, Thomas Lambert found that by the late 1550s, most Genevans were well versed in the basics of the Reformed faith, but the city's Consistory, a group of church leaders, still had to question people about their commitment to the Reformed faith. The system of catechism services, meant to educate children and new converts, was well established by 1560, but the consistory still had to deal with boys, skipping these services, fathers encouraging such behavior, and even a fencing instructor offering lessons during catechism hours. Calvin's Genevan Academy, established in 1559, became famous for training Reformed ministers, but it also adapted its curriculum to attract students from wealthy families who weren't necessarily called to the ministry. In terms of church practices, while Calvin insisted on the presence of fathers during baptisms, the Genevan Reformed practice also allowed for the traditional role of godparents, which was not biblically based. Inconsistencies also appeared in Genevan music. Jerome Bolsec, who publicly challenged Calvin's teaching on predestination, wrote a song with his own theology, but set to a tune from the Geneva Psalter. Even though Bolsec was banished, his song remained part of Genevan culture. Daniel Truckman later found that polyphonic singing persisted in Geneva, despite Calvin's preference for plainsong in church services. To better understand Reformation-era Geneva, scholars need to explore areas like gender, dynamics, economic factors, and connections to Catholicism. For example, while women appear in consistory records, there is still a need for a gender-based analysis of the reforming process. Mark Valeri has briefly explored Calvin's views on money lending and the idea of a Christian economy, but more work is needed to connect the economy to religious aspects of the Reformation. One of the most significant areas for further research is the ongoing relationships between Genevans and Catholics. Despite the city's reputation for intolerance, Geneva was nearly surrounded by Catholic territories, and its gates were not closed to travelers or merchants. People were not physically prevented from leaving the city for their affairs. While heresy could lead to banishment or, in rare cases, execution, and certain interactions with Catholics could be seen as treason, the city did not handle most Catholic interactions this way. For example, William Nafy's study of the 1534 heresy trial of Baudichamp Maisonneuve in Lyon shows that the city authorities there quietly released him to preserve economic relations with the Swiss. Despite these interactions, Geneva is often left out of discussions about religious coexistence in early modern Europe. Gilles Félien and Bertrand Forclaz have referred to the region as biconfessional, but this idea has not gained widespread acceptance. Recent works on multiconfessionalism in cities, like those in the Holy Roman Empire and the Netherlands, have much to offer in understanding Geneva. These studies explore how people justified religious coexistence in early modern terms, despite the absolute nature of religious polemics at the time. Geneva's rules and boundaries, often seen as signs of rigid dogmatism, could also be viewed as a system that allowed for negotiation, equivocation, and even deception. The concept of a unified Christianity, recognizing basic religious commonalities despite doctrinal differences, might help explain the success and incompleteness of the Reformation in Geneva. Genevans sometimes participated in Catholic ceremonies outside the city, especially for family events. City legislation shows that while Geneva was a single confession city, in terms of who could legally live there, Genevans were not banned from contact, trade, or maintaining family relations with Catholics. The city council tried to control interactions with non-Genevans, but did not end them. For example, non-residents could stay for up to 3 days without permission, which was enough time to conduct business. In 1561, the city published an edict requiring bourgeois to get permission before leaving. But it emphasized that the city was open and free, and residents were not forced to stay against their will. These insights suggest that the traditional image of Calvin's Geneva as a city of rigid intolerance needs to be reconsidered. The reality was more complex, with room for negotiation and coexistence, even in a city known for its strict Reformed faith. Rose Tissot was a long-time resident of Geneva, working as a servant for a nobleman named Matthew Kennard. One day, the Consistory, which was like a church court, called Tissot in for a meeting. The Consistory was a group of church leaders who made sure people in Geneva followed the rules of the Reformed Church. Tissot told the Consistory that he had gone back to his hometown, Cruzeil, when his father died. There, he attended a Catholic Mass and helped bury his father just as was the custom. The Consistory was not happy about this and decided to suspend Tissot from taking communion, which is a special church ritual. They also sent him to the small council, which was like the city government, to make things right. A few months later, Tissot came back to the Consistory, along with a few others, asking to be readmitted to the church. The Consistory listened to their apologies and decided to let them return to communion. Tissot had to make a public apology in front of the church congregation, but he was welcomed back. This case shows that even though Geneva was a Reformed city, people like Tissot could still have close ties to their Catholic families. Tissot was able to leave Geneva to attend his father's funeral, and he was allowed to come back and rejoin the community. The Consistory and the city council did not banish him or treat him harshly. Instead, they gave him a chance to make things right and rejoin the church. Another example is Jacques Corson. He was a resident of Geneva who had also taken communion in the Reformed Church. One day he went back to his hometown of Palouan-en-Berry for his father's funeral. There he attended a Catholic Mass. When he returned to Geneva, the Consistory called him in. Corson admitted what he had done and said he was sorry. The Consistory gave him a strong warning and told him to make a public apology before the next communion service. Corson was quickly forgiven and allowed to rejoin the community. These cases show that the Consistory and the city council were not always as strict as they might have seemed. They understood that people had family obligations and sometimes needed to visit their Catholic relatives. As long as these people showed they were sorry and willing to follow the rules of the Reformed Church, they were often allowed to return to the community without much trouble. There was also a young French teenager named Bonnet Cointy. He had taken communion in Geneva, but then went back to France to visit his mother. The Consistory called him in and asked why he had gone back. Bonnet simply said he went to see his mother. The Consistory didn't ask him many questions about his faith or what he did in France. They just told him to make a public apology and rejoin the church. In another case, Georges Mallet and his wife went to visit her mother. They told the Consistory that they never attended a Catholic Mass. The Consistory wasn't completely convinced, but didn't punish them harshly. They just told Georges to make sure his wife learned more about the Reformed faith. These examples show that even in a city that was officially Reformed, people could still have close ties to their Catholic families. The Consistory and the city council were willing to be flexible and understanding, as long as people showed they were committed to the Reformed faith. This flexibility allowed people to maintain their family relationships and still be part of the Reformed community in Geneva. Despite the strict rules and the reputation of the Reformed Church, life in Geneva was not as rigid as it might seem. People could still visit their Catholic relatives, attend Catholic funerals, and return to Geneva without being permanently punished. This shows that the Reformation in Geneva was not just about strict rules and punishments, but also about finding ways to accommodate the complex lives of its residents. In the winter of 1597, Queen Elizabeth I of England had a visit from the French ambassador, André Hurault de Metz. De Metz later wrote about his visit to Henry IV, describing the state of the English Church and the Queen's thoughts on religion. He noted that the English Church was much like the Church in Geneva, but with some differences in the way they celebrated the Lord's Supper. The English also kept some old ceremonies like wearing special clothes and using bells and organs. However, de Metz also mentioned that Queen Elizabeth didn't seem to be a big fan of John Calvin, the famous reformer from Geneva. She told de Metz that she had never read Calvin's works and preferred the writings of the early church fathers. This mix of admiration and skepticism toward Calvin and his ideas reflects the complex relationship between England and Calvinism during the Elizabethan era. Historians have long debated how much Calvin's ideas influenced the English church. Some argue that there was a broad Calvinist consensus on key doctrines, especially predestination, while others point out that there were significant differences in tone and emphasis among English Protestants. One of the most revealing moments in this debate came during the admonition controversy of the 1570s. This controversy began in 1572, when two London preachers, John Field and Thomas Wilcox, published a pamphlet called An Admonition to the Parliament. They were frustrated that Parliament wasn't doing enough to reform the Church and called for the end of the episcopal system, where bishops run the Church, and the establishment of a Presbyterian system, where churches are run by a group of elders. The controversy heated up even more a few months later when a second pamphlet, A Second Admonition to the Parliament, appeared. This pamphlet was more detailed and harsher in its criticism of the existing church leaders. It was likely written by Christopher Goodman, a former exile to Geneva and a strong advocate for Presbyterianism. The pamphlet not only explained the Presbyterian model of church government, but also accused the Elizabethan bishops of being corrupt and hostile to true reform. Historians have often overlooked the second admonition because it was seen as confusing and hard to understand. However, recent research shows that it was widely read and discussed among the Puritans, who were a group of Protestants pushing for more radical reforms. For example, Sir Francis Hastings, a prominent Puritan, passed his copy of the pamphlet to Lawrence Thompson, who then shared it with Anthony Gilby. When several Puritans, including Goodman and Edward Daring, were called to answer for their actions in front of the Privy Council in 1573, the council was more interested in the second admonition than the first one. The established church leaders, like John Whitgift, were deeply troubled by the second admonition. Whitgift, in his response, refused to engage with the pamphlet's specific attacks on individual bishops, calling them opprobrious words and slanderous. He was particularly upset that the author and his supporters claimed to be the professed enemies of the Church of Christ. The author of the second admonition defended the harsh language, saying it was necessary to expose the corruption and to push for real reform. The admonition controversy revealed the deep divisions within the English Church. While there was a general agreement on core Calvinist doctrines, there were significant differences in how these doctrines should be applied. The Puritans wanted a more radical and immediate reform, while the established church leaders, including the Queen, were more cautious and preferred a gradual approach. This tension would continue to shape the religious and political landscape of England for decades to come. The Second Admonition, a mysterious and fiery pamphlet, has puzzled historians for centuries. The author, who remains anonymous, doesn't name his targets directly, making it hard to understand who he's really criticizing. However, some clues help us piece together the puzzle. One of the most obvious targets is the Pope of Lambeth, which everyone knew referred to Archbishop Matthew Parker. But there are other more subtle targets. For example, the pamphlet mentions the Politique Machévils of England. This was a clever reference that John Whitgift, a high-ranking church official, immediately recognized. Whitgift knew it meant the Queen's chief advisors, William Cecil and Nicholas Bacon, who were often called those two English Machiavels in a Catholic pamphlet from the same period. The author opens the pamphlet by drawing on biblical examples to show that the worst persecutors are often those who pretend to be on your side. He talks about how Cain murdered Abel, how Joseph's brothers betrayed him, and how Judas betrayed Jesus. This sets the stage for his argument that the Elizabethan bishops, who claim to be godly, are actually the real persecutors. They slander, imprison, and even cause the deaths of good men like John Pullen, Thomas Horton, and Nicholas Curvile. These men, who had been exiled during Queen Mary's reign, were not executed, but the author believes their deaths were due to the bishops' harsh treatment. The author also points out the hypocrisy of the bishops. While they treat Protestants harshly, they are lenient with Catholics. He mentions how the bishops have opened their ears to Catholic complaints, but ignore complaints against Catholics. This is especially galling to the author, who believes that the bishops should have been more severe with known Catholic sympathizers like John Hanson, a former archdeacon who had fled to Europe. Hanson had been involved in the persecution of George Marsh, a Protestant martyr, and the author is furious that Hanson has not been properly punished. The author is also critical of Alexander Noel, the Dean of St. Paul's, who had a reputation as a fishing enthusiast. Noel had been a Marian exile and had strong ties to Geneva, but the author accuses him of breaking promises made during the exile. Noel is criticized for writing a catechism that the author sees as a step back towards Catholic practices. The author suggests that Noel, who once fled persecution, is now part of the system that persecutes others. The author even uses Noel's love of fishing to make a point. While Noel once feared being caught by the Catholic Bishop Bonner, he is now the one catching the godly. The Second Admonition also criticizes the entire Elizabethan Church, but it's clear that the author has specific people in mind. He argues that the bishops are false brethren who have betrayed the cause of true reform. They have left Catholic practices in place, failed to punish known Catholics, and secretly persecuted the godly. The author believes that the bishops are part of a conspiracy to hinder reform, and that the Church's structure is too corrupt to be saved. This criticism puts the Elizabethan Church leadership in a difficult position. They have to condemn the pamphlet without alienating those who still support further reform. For example, Matthew Hutton, a churchman with strong ties to Geneva, had to walk a fine line. Hutton, who was a protege of Archbishop Grindal, supported England's connection to the broader Reformed movement. He defended William Whittingham, who had been ordained by John Calvin in Geneva, and later pushed for the approval of the Lambeth Articles, which were strongly Calvinist. the second admonition reveals a deep divide within the Elizabethan Church. The author sees the bishops as false brethren who have betrayed the cause of true reform, while the bishops see the Puritans as dangerous radicals. This tension would continue to shape the religious landscape of England for years to come. Hutton, a key figure in the Elizabethan Church, saw the current troubles as the culmination of long-standing issues. He explained to Burleigh, a powerful advisor to Queen Elizabeth, that the controversy over church policies and practices had been troubling many thoughtful people for nearly a decade. Initially, the calls for reform were focused on liturgical changes like those in Geneva, but they had grown into a broader critique of the entire church structure. Hutton pointed out that what started as a debate over simple things like the use of a cap, surplice, and tippet had escalated into a challenge against bishops, archbishops, and even the Queen's authority in religious matters. Hutton was concerned that the authors of the admonition pamphlets, which criticized the Church of England, were not respecting the Queen's supremacy over religious affairs. He noted that they seemed to follow John Calvin, a prominent reformer, who gave less authority to civil leaders in church matters compared to other theologians like Wolfgang Musculus. Hutton observed that these critics were adopting many of Calvin's ideas, even though Calvin himself emphasized obedience to authority and warned against rebellion. Hutton used a metaphor from Cicero to illustrate the problem. He asked how a commonwealth could be ruined so quickly, and the answer was that new, foolish, and young orators had taken charge. Hutton was careful not to directly attack Calvin, but questioned why those who followed Calvin's ideas were often disobedient and disrespectful to authority. He argued that these reformers not only wanted an equality among ministers, which he believed would lead to confusion and contention, but also sought to strip the Queen of her authority and give it to the people. Hutton feared that if every parish could choose its own minister, it could lead to chaos. Some parishes might choose a Catholic, while others might pick someone based on personal friendships rather than religious merit. Hutton believed that the form of church government should match the political structure of the state. He argued that while Calvin preferred a form of government that suited a republic, England was a kingdom, and its church government should reflect that. He thought that the Genevan model, which was more suited to a republic, would be dangerous and disrespectful to the Queen's authority if imposed on England. Hutton also acknowledged Calvin's significant contributions to the Church, describing him as a learned and worthy man. However, he emphasized that Calvin was still a human, and that his ideas could be flawed. Hutton believed that the authors of the admonition pamphlets had overlooked this fact and were trying to apply the Genevan model to England without considering its potential consequences. Richard Bancroft, another critic of the Puritans, also saw the admonition pamphlets as a threat. He argued that the first admonition, which called for the Genevan model, was largely ignored, and its authors were quickly imprisoned. However, the second admonition was more dangerous because it openly threatened to tear down the Elizabethan Church. Bancroft saw this as a declaration of war, as the authors were willing to proceed without legal authority and claimed that only the Genevan model was acceptable to God. Bancroft's perspective helps us understand why the establishment saw Calvinism as a credible threat. The admonition pamphlets were not just about religious reform, but also about challenging the authority of the Queen and the established church. This challenge was seen as a serious danger to the stability of the kingdom. Hutton and Bancroft's concerns highlight the complex relationship between religion and politics in early modern England. The Puritans' desire for a more reformed church was seen as a threat to the existing order, and their willingness to challenge authority made them a significant concern for the Elizabethan government. The admonition controversy was not just a theological debate, but a political struggle that had far-reaching implications for the future of the Church of England. John Knox and John Calvin, though different in many ways, shared a deep bond that shaped the course of the Reformed movement. Their relationship is a fascinating story of mutual respect and occasional tension, reflecting the complex dynamics of the Reformation era. Knox, a Scotsman with a fiery spirit, and Calvin, a Frenchman with a more intellectual approach, might seem like an unlikely pair, yet their paths crossed in Geneva, a city that became a hub for Protestant reformers. Knox first encountered Calvin when he was in exile, fleeing the persecution of Queen Mary in England. He arrived in Geneva, seeking answers to his pressing questions about the faith and the role of the Church. Calvin, despite his busy schedule, briefly met with Knox and directed him to Pierre Viret in Lausanne. Later, Knox returned to Geneva, where he found a welcoming community and a place to study and grow in his faith. During his time in Geneva, Knox developed a strong connection with the city and its leaders, particularly with Calvin. He even adopted a Latin name, Tinotarius, which referred to his birthplace near the river Tyne. Geneva became a second home for Knox, and he described it as the most perfect school of Christ he had ever seen. This was a place where the Bible was central and the church was organized in a way that Knox believed was closest to the early Christian model. Knox's time in Geneva was not just about personal growth. It was also about preparing for his future role in the Scottish Reformation. He and his fellow exiles, including Christopher Goodman, created a template for a Reformed church, which included a Bible, a metrical psalter, and an order of worship. They believed that this model, developed under Calvin's influence, would be the blueprint for the Reformed churches in Scotland and England. When Knox returned to Scotland in 1559, he became a key figure in the Scottish Reformation. He used his connection to Calvin and the Genevan Church to bolster his authority and to seek guidance on theological and ecclesiastical matters. However, this relationship was not always smooth. Calvin, who was known for his patience and wisdom, sometimes found Knox's hard-lined stance on issues like resistance to rulers challenging. Despite this, Calvin continued to show affection and respect for Knox, even when Knox's actions, such as the publication of the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, caused tension with Queen Elizabeth of England. Knox's loyalty to Calvin was evident in his defense of Calvin's teachings, especially on predestination. In 1560, Knox wrote a long tract, an answer to a great number of blasphemous cavilitions, which was a detailed defense of Calvin's doctrine of predestination. Knox was meticulous in using Calvin's words and arguments to support his own views, showing his deep commitment to the Reformed faith. Despite their differences, the relationship between Knox and Calvin was marked by mutual respect and a shared vision for the Reformed Church. Knox saw Calvin as a spiritual father and a mentor, while Calvin viewed Knox as a dedicated and energetic follower. Their bond, though sometimes strained, played a crucial role in the spread of Reformed theology and the establishment of Reformed churches in Scotland and beyond. John Knox and John Calvin, two of the most influential figures of the Reformation, had a complex relationship. While they agreed on many theological points, such as predestination, their approaches often diverged, especially when it came to practical matters like worship and resistance to rulers. Knox, a Scottish reformer, was deeply influenced by Calvin's teachings, but also developed his own distinct ideas. For example, when it came to predestination, Knox focused more on the idea of single predestination, which means God chooses who will be saved, but doesn't specifically choose who will be damned. Calvin, on the other hand, believed in double predestination, where God chooses both who will be saved and who will be damned. This difference in understanding led Knox to emphasize God's will more strongly, seeing it as the foundation of his salvation. In matters of worship, Knox had already formed his own views before he met Calvin. He believed that worship should strictly follow the Bible, a principle known as the regulative principle. This meant that anything not explicitly commanded in the Bible should not be part of worship. Knox's approach was more rigid than Calvin's, who was more flexible and less concerned with liturgical details. When Knox was in Geneva, he and his allies tried to reform the worship practices of the English exiles, leading to a significant dispute in Frankfurt. Calvin, however, was more concerned with maintaining unity among the exiles and avoiding unnecessary conflict. One of the most significant areas of disagreement between Knox and Calvin was their stance on resistance to rulers. Calvin taught that Christians should submit to temporal authorities, even if they were unjust. Knox, however, believed that it was right to resist and even depose a ruler who was persecuting the true faith. This belief was shaped by the persecution of Protestants in England during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor. Knox and his friend Christopher Goodman wrote tracts calling for the deposition of Mary, which were published in Geneva. These writings caused a lot of trouble for Calvin and Geneva, as Queen Elizabeth I, who succeeded Mary, was offended and distanced herself from the Genevan reformers. The fallout from Knox's writings had long-lasting consequences. Calvin and Geneva were seen as supporters of rebellion, which damaged their reputation in Europe. In England, this led to a shift in the Reformed movement, with the Church of England turning more towards the influence of Zurich and Heinrich Bullinger. In Scotland, however, the example of Geneva was embraced, and the Scottish Kirk Church adopted many of Geneva's practices and teachings, becoming a strong Reformed church. Despite the tensions, Knox's relationship with Calvin and the Genevan reformers had a significant impact on the Reformation. Knox's experiences and ideas, shaped by his time in Geneva, helped form the Reformed tradition in Scotland and influenced the development of Puritanism in England. Calvin, while skeptical of the cult of Geneva, left a legacy that was interpreted and adapted by later generations, including Knox and his followers. In the end, the relationship between Knox and Calvin shows that even among those who share the same faith, there can be significant differences in how they understand and apply it. These differences often reflect the unique experiences and contexts of the individuals involved, and they can have far-reaching consequences for the shape of religious traditions